The heat over Camp Coral drifted like smoke, distorting the horizon into a wavering lie. Everything shimmered, the fences, the sandbags, even the flag that hung heavy against its pole. Noon in Djibouti was merciless. The air didn't move, the flies didn't dare, and the men trudged about with that restless stillness soldiers carry when they know something ugly is brewing. Inside the command tent, that ugliness had found its voice. Lieutenant Marcus Hale loomed over a map littered with red markers, his hand cutting through the air as he spoke. "We'll move the unit through Sector 4 at 0600. Simple sweep, no delays." Across the table stood Commander Erin Cade, her uniform immaculate, her eyes calm, calculating. Her presence carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd already seen hell and come back without asking permission. She didn't flinch under pressure. She didn't need to prove herself, though in the Navy, being a woman among SEAL meant proving yourself twice as hard every single day. "There's a flaw in that route," Erin said, her tone steady. "The last recon drone flagged movement along the ridge. You're walking our men straight into a crossfire." The room stiffened. Two junior officers froze behind their screens. They knew the look on Hale's face, the tightening jaw, the twitch beneath his right eye. He wasn't used to being corrected, least of all by her. "I didn't ask for your tactical opinion, Commander," he said. "You didn't have to," she replied evenly. "You asked for survival." The words landed with quiet precision, like a blade finding its mark. Hale's nostrils flared. The heat in the tent thickened, heavy with the smell of sweat and friction. For a long second, no one moved. Then he stepped closer, too close. The map between them crinkled under his knuckles. "You're out of line." Erin didn't blink. "I'm out of patience for arrogance." That did it. The moment cracked wide open. His hand came fast, a violent blur through the air. The back of it struck her across the jaw with a sound that sliced through the room, not loud but final. The corporal by the radio flinched. The ensign's pen froze mid-scribble. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Erin's head turned with the impact. Her jaw tightened. Blood tasted like metal on her tongue. But when she straightened, her eyes met his, calm, cold, mercilessly human. She didn't yell, didn't move. Her silence became a weapon sharper than any retort. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Lieutenant," she said softly, almost like a prayer. Then she walked out. The flap of the tent closed behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. Hale stood frozen, breathing hard, the echo of what he'd done still vibrating through his bones. He told himself she deserved it, that she needed reminding who was in charge. But beneath the anger, something colder began to seep in, the first thin thread of dread. Outside, Erin kept walking until she reached the edge of the yard. The wind met her face, hot, dry, almost tender. She touched her jaw lightly, felt the pulse of the bruise rising. It would darken by nightfall, but bruises fade, reputations don't. That evening, her quarters were quiet except for the hum of the fan. She sat on the floor, cleaning her rifle piece by piece, the ritual steadying her hands. Every movement was methodical, disciplined, the same control she'd learned under fire when panic meant death. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She remembered the academy, where they called her too soft, the training yard, where she'd been left in the mud, bleeding, only to rise and outlast every man there. The missions where she dragged wounded brothers out of firefights, while they bled on her shoulders and called her a miracle. Respect was never handed to her. She'd earned it, inch by inch, scar by scar. And now, a man who couldn't lead without ego had tried to strip it all away with a single strike. She smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with the calm certainty of someone who understood the long game. The Navy had rules, the SEAL had codes, but she had something neither could touch, truth. When she finally lay back on her cot, the base outside had gone still. The night carried the distant murmur of radios and the sea wind brushing over metal. Erin closed her eyes, tasting the salt, feeling the dull throb in her jaw. This wasn't the first time a man had underestimated her. It would be the last time one did it and walked away whole. By morning, the bruise along Erin Cade's jaw had bloomed into a deep violet shadow. The mirror above her sink threw back a reflection she barely recognized. Not because of the injury, but because of what it represented. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to test her limits, but it was the first time one had dared to strike her. The corridors outside her quarters buzzed with their usual rhythm. Boots thudding, orders exchanged, the metallic clatter of gear. Yet beneath that hum lived something new, tension, the kind that slid between conversations like smoke. People whispered, but no one looked her in the eye for long. Fear of involvement had always been a loyal companion to injustice. Hale had made sure of that. Before dawn, he'd called a private debrief with the senior officers. He'd twisted the story into one of insubordination, claiming Cade had undermined his command in front of subordinates. He spoke of her emotional volatility, his words painting her strength as hysteria, her clarity as rebellion. It wasn't new. Men like him had been weaponizing language for centuries. But what Hale didn't know was that Erin had anticipated this. She understood the battlefield of perception better than anyone. While he played politics, she gathered proof, quietly, methodically. The security footage from the command tent, the time-stamped mission notes, and the testimonies of 2 witnesses who hadn't been able to sleep since that afternoon. The first domino had already tipped. By midweek, the air between them grew poisonous. Hale strutted the base as if nothing had happened. But guilt made his temper unpredictable. His orders came clipped, his patience non-existent. Even his closest allies noticed the shift, the subtle paranoia, the way he snapped at shadows. Erin didn't respond. She stayed professional, focused, unshaken. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. 2 nights later, an assignment came through. A joint training exercise in the Badlands north of the coast. A simulated extraction with live drones and dummy ordnance. Hale volunteered to lead. Erin was listed as second in command. She knew what that meant. He wanted a stage. The operation began under a swollen moon. The landscape stretched in ghostly shades of gray, sand whispering under their boots. The simulation was supposed to be straightforward. A sweep through an abandoned range to locate a missing team and extract under time pressure. But the comms channels crackled with static almost immediately, and Erin's gut twisted. Something was wrong. She checked the coordinates and froze. The route Hale had selected crossed into a flagged zone, one marked in every database as compromised by smuggler movement. The live fire sensors shouldn't have been armed there, unless someone had ignored the warnings. Hale, she said quietly over the comms, we're too far north. We need to pull back, static. Then his voice, cool and dismissive. I've got it under control, Commander. Her grip tightened around her rifle. Control, that word again. The one men like him clung to right before losing it completely. Minutes later, the night exploded. Tracer rounds streaked the darkness. Real bullets, not blanks. Dirt kicked up around their boots, and the air filled with the unmistakable crack of automatic fire. Someone screamed, someone else dropped. Contact, chaos rippled through the ranks. The simulation had turned into a live engagement, but no one knew how or why. Hale's voice vanished from the radio. Erin took over instinctively, barking orders, dragging men into cover, calculating angles from the flashes in the hills. Her movements were pure muscle memory, her breathing steady, heart cold and efficient. She spotted Hale crawling toward the wrecked transport, eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell is happening?" he shouted. "You didn't check the feed," she snapped, sliding beside him. "We're in an active corridor. Those are smugglers, not drones." His face went pale. He fumbled for the calm unit, trying to call it off, but it was too late. The insurgents had seen their uniforms. Erin made the decision without hesitation. She rallied the squad, coordinated suppressive fire, called in the emergency extraction beacon, and led 2 men through the smoke to retrieve the wounded. The desert roared around them, gunfire, wind, sand, but she moved through it like a blade through water. When the evac chopper finally arrived, the casualties were minimal. 3 injured, none dead. Against all odds, she'd kept them alive. Hale sat slumped against the vehicle, helmet in his hands, trembling. The reality of his negligence pressed on him heavier than the heat. He looked up at her. Dirt streaked across her face, her uniform torn, jaw still bruised from his hand, and saw what he'd never been able to admit. She was the soldier he pretended to be. She didn't speak, didn't look at him long enough to offer comfort or condemnation. She just turned and walked toward the medevac, her shadow stretching long under the rotor lights. The next morning, an official inquiry began, not because Erin filed a complaint, because the men she saved did. Morning sunlight fell over the compound like judgment. Cold, precise, unmerciful. The aftermath of the failed exercise hung over the base like fog. The hum of the generator, the whir of distant aircraft, the soft murmur of whispers, all of it felt heavier, slower, tainted. By 700 hours, the command deck was flooded with paperwork, reports, and men pretending not to know what they already knew. Someone had spoken. Someone always did, when guilt became unbearable. Hale's version of events had fractured under its own lies. The official notice came from Fleet Command. An inquiry would be conducted regarding command negligence, resulting in live-fire casualties. Hale's name sat at the top of the order. Erin Cade's appeared directly below his, not as an accused but as a witness. When the announcement went public, silence swept through the mess hall. Soldiers glanced up from their trays, some hiding smirks, others shame. The woman who had been whispered about all week now walked among them with quiet, terrifying composure. Erin didn't gloat. She didn't even look in his direction. She spent the next 2 days buried in reports. Methodical, calm, unflinching, her statements were clean. No exaggerations, no emotional edges. Just facts, timestamps, coordinates. Truth had its own gravity. It didn't need her to push. Hale, meanwhile, began to unravel. Sleep eluded him. His reflection mocked him. Every corridor he walked through felt lined with eyes. Men who had once saluted him now stepped aside without meeting his gaze. That kind of isolation, the kind born of guilt and exposure, was something even battle-hardened soldiers couldn't withstand. On the third day, the tribunal assembled. It wasn't grand. Just a temporary court under a white tent at the edge of the base. A table, 3 officers, 2 flags, and a silence so sharp it could cut skin. Erin sat at the far end, uniform pressed, hands clasped, eyes forward. Hale sat across, his once perfect posture gone slack. When they called her name, she rose. The air shifted. "Commander Cade," the presiding officer said, "please recount the incident of the 20th. Her voice, when it came, carried the same steadiness it always had. At 1300 hours, Lieutenant Hale questioned my tactical correction on a field map. The exchange escalated. He struck me. A ripple moved through the room. Subtle, but there. She continued without pause. 2 days later, during Operation Sandline, a misfiled coordinate placed our unit within a live-fire smuggler route. Lieutenant Hale failed to verify the data before authorization. I assumed control to extract the team and minimize casualties. Her tone didn't change. She didn't look at him once. It was pure professionalism, and somehow that hurt him more than accusation ever could. The panel reviewed the log sheet submitted, audio fragments, bodycam footage, the recovered calm transcripts. Each one cut deeper. There was no shouting match, no outburst. Just evidence. Cold, indisputable. When Hale was called to respond, his words stumbled. He tried to sound confident, authoritative, but the air around him betrayed desperation. It was a misunderstanding. Commander Cade overstepped protocol. He stopped, because Erin was still looking straight ahead, unmoved. The weight of that quiet broke something inside him. The lead officer finally spoke. "Lieutenant Hale, the evidence is clear. You falsified documentation and jeopardized your team. Commander Cade's conduct, under extreme conditions, upheld operational integrity. You are hereby suspended pending discharge." Hale didn't move. For a moment, he just sat there staring at nothing, his entire illusion collapsing in on itself. When it was over, Erin stood outside the tent. The wind had picked up, carrying sand and salt from the coast. She watched the horizon, steady, silent. Around her, the base carried on. Men moving, vehicles rumbling, life continuing as if justice were just another routine. But inside her, something shifted. It wasn't triumph, it was release. Quiet, exhausted, incomplete. A young corporal approached her, the same one who'd been in the tent the day she was struck. He stopped, unsure if he should speak. Then he did. "Ma'am, I saw what happened that day. I should have said something soon." Erin looked at him, not with judgment, but with the weary understanding of someone who'd long stopped expecting courage from the comfortable. "You spoke now," she said simply. "That's what matters." That night she returned to her quarters. The bruise had faded, a faint trace under the skin, a ghost of humiliation turned into strength. She sat by the small window, listening to the waves beyond the fence. Her journal lay open beside her, blank except for a single sentence written days ago. "Some wars are fought without bullets." She traced the words with her finger, then added another line beneath it. "And the hardest victories are the ones no one cheers for." Somewhere on base, Hale packed what was left of his things. He'd been ordered to leave at dawn. His name, once spoken with authority, now carried the hollow echo of disgrace. Erin didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. Some defeats don't need witnesses. They just need time to sink in. The dawn of his discharge was quiet. Too quiet for a man whose voice had once filled briefing rooms. Lieutenant Hale stood outside the barracks, his duffel slung over one shoulder, watching the last morning he would ever spend in uniform. The sea mist rolled across the training fields, curling around the metal fences like memory refusing to fade. His car was waiting by the gate, an unmarked sedan, government-issued, lifeless as a verdict. He'd been told to leave the base quietly, no ceremony, no salute, just paperwork and silence. As he passed through the final checkpoint, the guard barely nodded. Hale muttered a dry thanks, but it dissolved into the wind before anyone heard it. The gate clanged shut behind him. Sharp, final, absolute. Inside that sound he heard his entire career closing. For weeks afterward, he drifted. Bars, cheap motels, forgotten roads. The kind of places soldiers went when they weren't ready to be civilians. His reflection in the mirror grew unrecognizable, not just from the stubble or fatigue, but from the hollow where conviction used to live. He'd once believed he was untouchable, a name carved into command charts, a man who shaped others' fates. But now every newspaper headline about female operatives in special units felt like a blade. They were celebrating her, the woman he had dismissed, the one he had struck. Meanwhile, Erin Cade didn't celebrate. She worked. The tribunal's conclusion had given her recognition she never sought. Promotions, recommendations, quiet nods in corridors from men who had once ignored her. Yet none of it felt clean. Victory had left a residue, the kind that clung to conscience. Her days became a cycle of missions, reports, and silence. Her nights, however, belonged to ghosts. She'd see Hale's face in the back of her mind. Not the arrogant officer who struck her, but the broken man sitting in the tribunal, realizing what he'd done too late. Pity wasn't the right word, but something close to it lived in her chest. 2 months later, she was assigned to a classified recon team in the Baltic. The operation was supposed to be straightforward: infiltration, extraction, minimal contact. But war had its own sense of irony. Their transport came under fire mid-flight. One engine caught flame, spiraling them into the black ice fields below. The crew survived the crash, but their signal was dead. For 72 hours, they endured sub-zero temperatures, rationing what little warmth discipline could provide. Erin led them through the wreckage. Quiet, decisive, unyielding. When one of her men collapsed from hypothermia, she carried him on her back for miles, refusing to stop. When the rescue team finally found them, one medic whispered, "She saved them all." The report reached headquarters. Her name was once again passed around briefing tables, but this time it wasn't whispered. It was spoken with a respect that came too late for apologies. One morning, months later, she received a letter forwarded from command. The envelope was old, creased, the handwriting hesitant. It bore no rank insignia, just a name, Nathan Hale. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note, unpolished, raw, almost broken. "Commander Cade, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to say that I see now what I didn't then. You carried integrity like armor. I wore arrogance like a shield. Only one of us was built to survive the truth. Nathan, no address, no request, just confession. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in her journal beside her earlier words. The ink had faded a little, but the meaning hadn't. Some wars are fought without bullets. Weeks passed. She never replied, not because she didn't want to, but because some lessons once learned don't need to echo. Across the ocean, in a quiet coastal town, hail work construction, heavy lifting, quiet days, long nights. The kind of life that required no orders, no hierarchy, no ego, just effort. Sometimes, when the noise of machinery paused, he'd stare at the horizon and think about the sea he'd once commanded others to face. He never told anyone about her, but every time he saw a woman in uniform pass by, he'd lower his head slightly, a silent, wordless salute. Back on base, Erin stood before a class of recruits one morning, her voice steady as she said, "Respect is not a favor, it's a discipline." None of them knew her story in full, just fragments of rumor. But they listened, they always did. The cycle of command would continue. New officers, new soldiers, new wars. Yet somewhere in those rotations, a piece of that story, their story, would survive. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that strength has no gender and humility has no rank. That night, she watched the sunset from the docks, her reflection rippling over the dark water. For the first time in a long while, she let herself exhale. The bruise was long gone, the scars invisible. But beneath them all, something indestructible had formed. The quiet dignity of a warrior who never needed revenge to win. 5 years had passed. Time had thinned the memory of that tribunal, worn down the sharp edges of scandal until it existed only in whispers. Bases changed, names rotated, ranks shifted. The world moved on, or at least pretended to. Commander Erin Cade had seen more of the world's dark corners than most. Her file was heavy with successful extractions, covert strikes, and rescues no one outside the walls of intelligence would ever hear about. She'd earned every stripe stitched on her sleeve, every scar carved into her skin. But the deeper she went into the field, the quieter she became. There were things she'd never said aloud, like how every mission left her with a growing distance from ordinary life. How the world of civilians felt foreign now, fragile in its simplicity. Or how, every once in a while, when the wind hit her jaw just right, she remembered that single moment, the crack of bone, the flash of disbelief, the silence after. It wasn't pain anymore. It was a reminder of everything she refused to become. That winter, she was stationed in a NATO command center off the coast of Norway. Frozen mountains surrounded the base, white and endless, like a canvas waiting for disaster. She was overseeing a multinational security exercise, until disaster found them first. An oil freighter had gone dark in the Arctic Circle, carrying classified materials listed under multiple flags. The ship's distress signal had triggered briefly before cutting out, intercepted by both NATO and private military frequencies. Within hours, the ocean became a chessboard of competing claims and unclear loyalties. Erin was assigned to lead the rescue and recovery, a small team, no backup, just like old times. The helicopter touched down on an ice shelf near the coordinates. Wind howled like an animal, tearing through their calms. The ship lay half-submerged in the black water ahead, its hull fractured, lights flickering like dying stars. Erin scanned the perimeter. 4 survivors huddled near the stern, waving weakly. She motioned to her team to approach. But as they neared, movement caught her eye. Shadows along the upper deck, moving too fast, too deliberate to be survivors. Mercenaries. The realization hit instantly. Someone else was here for the cargo. Gunfire shattered the night, sharp and merciless. Her team hit the ice, returning fire in disciplined bursts. The clash echoed across the frozen expanse. Erin barked orders, flanking left, moving between shattered containers and ice-crusted railings. The air smelled of salt and smoke. One of her men shouted through the calms, "We're pinned." West side, she sprinted toward them, until a figure emerged through the haze ahead, weapon raised. For a second, her instinct screamed to shoot. But then she saw his face through the fog. It couldn't be Nathan Hale. He was older, harder, but unmistakable. Beard grown out, uniform stripped of insignia, eyes weathered but alive. He looked nothing like the officer who'd once stood over her in arrogance. He looked like a man who'd been broken and rebuilt in the dark. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The storm howled between them. Then he lowered his weapon. Cade, his voice cracked through the static. "They've got hostages below deck." Her mind caught up to the reality before her eyes could. He wasn't with them, he was fighting them. No time for questions. They moved as if the years between them had never existed, covering each other's blind spots, coordinating without words. The rhythm was seamless, instinctive, professional. Hale knew the layout, guiding her through the corridors while gunfire thundered overhead. They found the hostages in a flooded cargo hold. 3 crewmen, half frozen, terrified. Aaron knelt, checking their vitals while Hale secured the exits. His movements were precise, efficient, the kind of precision that came from someone who'd been humbled, not hollowed. When they reached the deck again, the extraction chopper was inbound. Aaron covered the evac route while Hale provided suppressive fire, his aim steady even under chaos. One round caught his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. He just grunted, reloaded, and kept shooting. By the time the last survivor was aboard, the ship was burning. Aaron turned toward him, breath visible in the cold air. "We're leaving." He shook his head. "You go." "Not happening." She grabbed his arm, hauling him toward the rope line as the deck groaned beneath them. Flames cracked, ice shattered, the sea roared, but together they made the jump. The chopper lifted, blades slicing through smoke and snow. Inside, the medics moved to patch Hale's wound. He waved them off, eyes finding hers across the cabin. The years fell away in that single look. Not romantic, not sentimental. Just the quiet recognition between 2 soldiers who had survived each other and themselves. He managed a faint smile. "Didn't think I'd see you again." She didn't smile back, but her eyes softened. "You almost didn't." He chuckled weakly. "Story of my life." The helicopter banked toward the horizon, the fiery wreck of the freighter shrinking below them. Erin sat back, gaze distant. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to carry the past like armor. Maybe forgiveness wasn't spoken. Maybe it was something earned in silence, in action. And for Hale, maybe redemption didn't come in grand apologies or headlines. Maybe it came in moments like this, in saving someone, in standing beside the person you once wronged, not as equals, but as human beings who finally understood the cost of pride. The storm raged on outside, but inside, for the first time in years, both of them found stillness. When the helicopter touched down at the Arctic base, dawn was just beginning to wash the horizon in pale gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt earned. The rescued crew were rushed into medical, the operation tagged as classified successful. Erin Cade stepped off last, boots crunching on the frost. Her body ached, her uniform was scorched, and her jaw, that same old scar of memory, throbbed faintly against the cold wind. But her mind was sharp, steady. She had seen worse, done harder, yet this one felt different. Hale was being treated inside the med bay, a bullet grazed across his shoulder and a mild concussion. When she walked in, the medic straightened automatically, but she waved him off. "Give us a minute." The door closed. The room was warm, too warm, filled with the hum of medical machines. Hale sat on the cot, bandage half-wrapped, eyes avoiding hers like a man unsure if he'd earned the right to look. "You shouldn't have been there," she said finally. Her tone wasn't angry, just measured, almost curious. "I wasn't supposed to be," he admitted. "Private contract, maritime security." The freighter's distress call went public before command could filter it. I signed on for hazard pay. He gave a short laugh that held no humor. "Didn't expect you to walk out of that storm." Erin crossed her arms. "You've changed." He met her gaze then. "Took losing everything to learn what I should have known all along." Silence settled. Not heavy, not sharp, just real. The kind of silence where 2 people understand that words will never fully bridge the past. But maybe they don't need to. "You saved lives tonight," she said. He shook his head. We did. You led. I followed, the way it should have been. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second. You learned to follow. That's not nothing, he smiled. Small, genuine, tired. I had a good teacher. I just didn't know it at the time. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. Nathan. He looked up. You can stop carrying it now. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw his posture change. The rigidness in his shoulders giving way to something like release. She didn't mean it as forgiveness. It was permission, the kind that only comes from someone who has truly let go. When she stepped outside, the snow was falling again. Quiet, thin, endless, she tilted her head back, letting it land on her face. The wind whispered through the hangars, carrying with it the faint sound of rotors and waves. She thought about the girl she'd been years ago, the one standing in that tent, shock blooming beneath a bruised jaw. That girl had wanted justice. The woman she'd become had found something harder, peace. Later that week, she wrote a report on the operation. It was concise, clinical, professional. She didn't mention Hale by name, just an unaffiliated operative assisted in the rescue. Her co read it and said, "You could have made yourself the hero here." She'd smiled faintly. Heroes don't write their own names into the story. Months passed. The Arctic gave way to new deployments, jungles, deserts, cities that never slept. Her reputation grew quietly, her leadership shaping the next generation of operatives. Those who served under her said she had a calm that couldn't be shaken, an authority that didn't need to be shouted. And somewhere far south, in a small coastal town, Nathan Hale rebuilt his life plank by plank. He worked on boats now, repairing hulls, cleaning decks, earning just enough to keep the ocean near. Sometimes at dawn, he'd stand at the edge of the dock, coffee in hand, watching the horizon. There was peace in the simplicity, but every now and then, he'd see a patrol ship cutting across the distance, grey, strong, quiet, and he'd wonder if she was on it. He never reached out again. Some things didn't need revisiting, but the respect he carried for her had turned into something lasting. Not guilt anymore, but gratitude. She had taught him what command really meant, that it wasn't about power. It was about restraint, about knowing when to lead, when to listen, and when to stand down. Years later, when Erin finally retired, she found herself standing by the same shoreline, watching the waves that had shaped her. She no longer wore the uniform, but discipline was still in her bones. She closed her eyes and thought of every soldier who had come and gone, every injustice she had endured, every lesson carved into her skin. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Some wars end without a victor, only survivors." The tide rolled in, cool and steady, washing over her boots. She smiled, not because she'd won, but because she'd healed. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, another soul, a man who had once struck her and learned too late what strength truly was, felt that same quiet peace, as if the sea itself carried her forgiveness across the distance. Two lives once bound by violence, now connected by silence, both standing on opposite shores, no longer defined by what happened between them, but by what they became after. And that, in the language of warriors, was victory enough.